Do you ever feel like layers in Photoshop are kind of stupid? Or maybe you're getting the hang of them, but you still have no idea if you're using them the right way. Well, regardless of what camp you're in, the fact is that layers are the core skill needed to make better edits, designs, or composites in Photoshop. Without layers, you just won't be getting very far. But fortunately, there are core foundations to layers that will apply to every project that you work on, so you can save time, create more interesting projects, and stop feeling like Photoshop is such an uphill battle. So to help you get there, I've created for you the ultimate layer curriculum in this video, including follow-along projects, design assets, and additional resources to help you reach layer confidence in under an hour, totally free. We're gonna start things off easy, dip our toes in the water, and then be swimming in the deep end by the end of this video. There are timestamps below if you need them, but most importantly, to access all the images, projects, design assets, and the free lesson cheat sheet to serve as your quick reference guide to layers in the future, just check the description below. Now, the first and most important thing to understand about layers is what they're even for. Because without this understanding, they can just seem like a hindrance rather than a tool in your projects. Rather than having everything be applied onto one single image, your layers allow you to break up your image into multiple parts. In an example such as this, we can combine different photos together to create something totally new. Since we are using layers, we can tell Photoshop that we want some images to appear in front or behind other layers in our project. Now that might sound confusing, but let's go ahead and look at our layers panel to understand what's going on here. As we see in the layers panel, we have 4 different layers here. I can click on them to select the different layers. Each of these layers has its own independent piece of the canvas, and they are stacked on top of one another like pages in a book or like panes of glass. When we look on our canvas, we're seeing everything from the top down. That means that this topmost layer, which is our cliff, is going to appear in front of any of the other layers beneath it. To make this a little bit more clear, I'll click on this castle text layer and grab the move tool by pressing V. Clicking and dragging on this text layer, if I go and continue down the canvas, it starts to go behind the cliff. That's because our text layer is behind our cliff layer within the layer stack. If I go and bring this castle text layer above the cliff layer, now we see it in front of everything else. And like I mentioned before, we see everything in a top-down view, meaning that whatever is at the top of our layer stack will appear in front of all of the layers beneath it on our canvas. So that is the key value of working with layers. Imagine if we had all of these different elements within this photo all inside of a single layer. I wouldn't be able to go and reposition just the text or reposition just the cliff layer or turn off the castle layer and things like that. By having layers, we can independently edit every element of our project, and it gives us way more flexibility of how we can create in Photoshop. Now, throughout all the other examples in this lesson, you'll see all the nuances of working with layers, but at the most basic level, the value of layers is that everything is independent and can be edited one by one within your project. Rather than editing your canvas as a whole, you can isolate your adjustments to specific pieces of your project. So with that in mind, let's move on to example 2. But before we get there, I want to make sure that your layer panel looks the exact same way as mine. So clicking on the hamburger menu of your layers panel, we can go down to the panel options. Inside of the window that appears, we can choose the thumbnail size for our layers. I currently have mine set to large so everyone can see them nice and clearly. You can choose what represents the thumbnail of your layer. I would recommend choosing the entire document so you see your current layer in relation to the whole canvas. And then I also leave all of these settings enabled here. I would recommend you do the same if you want everything to match up as you see on the screen. So with that good to go, I'll click OK, and let's start by opening up a photo in a new project to understand what different types of layers are available in Photoshop. By opening this image directly into Photoshop, just by going to File, Open, and selecting that file, what we have in the Layers panel now is a background layer. But what's important to remember about background layers is that they cannot be edited directly by default, and whatever image you directly open into Photoshop within a new project will become a background layer by default. If you were to create a new blank document, your background layer would just be white or whatever solid color you chose in the new document window. But to prevent you from getting confused, essentially a background layer is just a layer that you can't edit, but we can change that. If you look over on the right, there is a lock, and we all understand what a lock is. It means we can't do something. This is telling us that there are certain attributes of this layer that we cannot edit or change. However, if we want to actually edit this layer, we can just click on the lock icon like so, and it will convert your background layer into a regular editable layer. So in this case, we now have seen two different types of layers. We saw our background layer, which was the default layer that is created whenever you open a new image or create a new document. And the second type of layer that we now see is what I like to call just an image layer. It's a photo that has its own layer and it is not a background layer. To make all of this a little bit easier to understand, I'm just going to go back and create individual new layers for every type of layer that we discuss. Pressing Command or Control Z to undo that. This converts that layer back into a background layer. I can turn this background layer into a regular layer by also duplicating it. So clicking on this layer, we can press Command or Control J to duplicate it. This now creates a copy of that layer as a regular image layer. I'll rename this to Image Layer. And that is the name of this type of layer. We now have 7 other layer types to discuss, but we're going to go through them quickly to prevent you from getting too bored, because we'll be getting into a more interesting project where you will see how all of these different layer types interact. But for now, we just want to understand what options we have available to us. So the next type of layer that we have is a transparent layer. And as you might guess, it is a layer that has absolutely nothing on it. Think of it like a window over top of your project. To create a new transparent layer, we just need to click on the new layer icon at the bottom of the layers panel, and this will create a new transparent layer above your last selected layer in the layer stack. We can tell it is transparent by looking at the layer thumbnail here. There is a little gray and white checkerboard which represents transparency inside of Photoshop. These layers are really useful for adding whatever manual adjustments you would like, such as brush effects or gradients, and you'll see some examples of how they're used throughout this lesson. But for now, I'll just call this to transparent layer, and then we'll move on to the next one. Our fourth layer type is called an adjustment layer, and I'm not going to go over all of the different adjustment layers in Photoshop, but instead I just want you to understand the basic concept. An adjustment layer allows you to apply some type of editing adjustment, whether that's exposure or color, to all of the layers beneath it, either by going to the adjustments panel and choosing the adjustment layer you would like to apply, or we can go down to the effects icon, click and hold, and then choose the same set of adjustments from this panel instead. It just depends on what workflow you like to use. If you don't see the adjustments panel, just go up to Window and down here to Adjustments to reveal it. This is my preferred method of creating adjustment layers. For this example, to make life easy, I'll create a brightness and contrast adjustment layer by clicking on it. Just like before, this will create a new layer above our last selected layer in the layer stack. While this layer is selected, we have a few other settings within the Properties panel where we can edit the values of this particular adjustment, such as adding some contrast and darkening the photo, for example. Now, an adjustment layer doesn't actually have any visible pixels on it, but it is just affecting how the pixels of the underlying layers beneath it in the layer stack appear. So if I were, for example, to bring this brightness and contrast adjustment underneath the image layer, it would no longer be visible because our image layer is above it and therefore blocking the brightness and contrast adjustment layer from view. If I disabled the visibility of the image layer by clicking this eyeball icon, disabling the visibility of that one layer, we now are seeing our transparent layer, which has nothing on it. We're not seeing our image layer because it is invisible. And then we see our brightness and contrast adjustment layer affecting our background layer, which in this case is our image. I'll place this back at the top of the layer stack, turn on the visibility of our image layer once again, and now let's move on to the fifth adjustment, which is fill layers. There are 3 different types of fill layers that you can choose from. I'll just talk about one one of them for now, but you can experiment with the others as you would like. We'll also be using multiple variations of them throughout this lesson. But to create a fill layer, we can just go to this adjustments icon, click and hold, and then choose from one of the three options, either solid color, gradient, or pattern. Depending on what one you choose, they're all pretty self-explanatory. It's going to create a layer that is fully filled with either a solid color of your choosing, a gradient of your choosing, or a pattern of your choosing. In this case, I'll go and choose a solid color, and in the window that appears, I can pick whatever color I would like, click OK, and now we have a color fill layer with the color indicated by this thumbnail here that we could go and use as a background in our projects or things like that. The same concept applies for gradients as well as pattern fill layers, so that's why I'm not going to discuss them here. Next up, we have type and shape layers, which are somewhat unique and only created when we use either the type tool or the shape tool. Finding the type tool by pressing T, or you can find it here in your toolbar. If we click on the canvas once, I can type something here, but you'll notice inside of the layers panel that we have a new type layer represented by the T. These are layers that contain text and are infinitely editable within their fonts, colors, sizing, and all those types of things. Basically, a type layer is just a place for your type to exist in your project. Shape layers follow a similar idea, except we need to use the shape tools. So pressing U to access your shape tools, or you can find them here in the toolbar. You can select from a variety of different shapes, but I'll just select the rectangle tool. And if I click and drag out like so, it will create a new shape as a new shape layer. And we know that it's a shape layer indicated by this little icon right here in the corner. Because it is a shape layer, it is made up of a path, which means that you can infinitely scale this type of layer without ever losing quality. We'll talk more about quality and layers in a later example, but just remember for now, shape layers are represented by this little icon. The final two options that we have are AI layers and smart objects. We'll quickly discuss AI layers and then we'll see smart objects in the next example. AI layers are created whenever we use the generative fill adjustment. To use that, we need to first create a selection. So if I activate the rectangular marquee tool, for example, I have the new selection mode enabled. I'll just create a box like so, and let's click on generative fill in the contextual taskbar. I'll just type in turtle as something to generate in this photo, and I'll click on generate. Since this video isn't about AI, I'll leave a resource down below if you want to learn more about generative fill, but what's most important for now is that you recognize that generative fill layers are their own type of layer. We can tell what is a generative fill layer similar to how we can tell a shape layer just looking at the bottom corner of the thumbnail. There's those two sparkly icons that just indicates that this was a layer created with AI. This also means that when we click on that layer, within our properties panel, we'll have different variations to choose from of the output on that particular layer. Again, we're not going to talk about AI in this lesson, but if you want to learn more, I have a masterclass video down below that you can watch after this lesson. The final type of layer that we have is a smart object, but I know that we've just covered a lot of different types of layers. It's a little bit confusing. How does this actually apply into a project that you want to go and work on? So that's what I want to show you in this next example. In this photo here, we're using all of these same layers that we just discussed, but now as an actual project. So let's break down how everything is being used. At the bottom of the layer stack, we have a background layer, which was made when I created my new blank document for this project. I then have my image layer, which I added into the project just by dragging and dropping it from my computer. Alternatively, you can add images into an existing project by going up to File and down here to Place Embedded. This particular layer is a smart object, which means that we can scale it up and down without losing quality. You can convert any layer into a smart object by right-clicking on it and going to Convert to Smart Object. This is our final type of layer that you need to remember, and that is represented by this icon right here. You'll see some more uses of smart objects in later examples, but for now, just remember what that icon represents, which is a smart object. Above that, we have a adjustment layer, which is the curves adjustment, and turning this on and off, it's adding some blue and contrast adjustments to the underlying layers, which is just the image layer in this case. Above that, we have two different transparent layers that I have have used to add brush adjustments on. So on one layer, I have used a grunge brush and painted blue to add blue around the canvas like so. Because I created a transparent layer, I had nothing on it, so I could just add whatever I needed to that layer to enhance my design. In this case, that was just a textured brush. I did the same thing with another transparent layer, but with white instead, so I have this layered effect of colors. Then to define this outer area where I wanted to put the text and the QR code for like a link to coaching or something like that, I have a shape layer, which is right here to fill in that extra area of the canvas. And with the help of these underlying transparent layers that I added those brush adjustments onto, I could basically turn a boring edge of a shape into something a little bit more interesting. So hopefully you're starting to see how these different types of layers can be used together. You'll see more examples as we go through, but hopefully the gears are now turning a bit more. From there, we have our type layers, which of course are pretty self-explanatory. We have one type layer up top and another one down at the bottom. And then we have two image layers for our QR code as well as the logo for this. With all of this together, we have quite a few different types of layers all working together to create a unique project. By themselves, like we saw in that first example, individual layers can kind of seem a bit boring and pointless, but as you start to put everything together, you can start to imagine how you can use them better in your projects. Now, as you start to add more and more layers into your project, it doesn't take long for things to start looking quite overwhelming. Just looking at this stack of layers, it's pretty easy to be like, what the heck is going on here? So that is where layer organization comes into play, and there's some really easy ways that we can do that. The first option that we have to organize our layers is to rename them. This is basically done in the same way as renaming a file on your computer. Just simply hover over the text of that layer, double click on it, and then type whatever you would like to rename it. Press enter when you're done and your layer will be renamed. The other option that we have is to group all of our related layers so that we can consolidate a large layer stack into just a few different groups. For example, I could go and group the shape as well as the brush layers. Since they're all related, I could group all of those into one, so that way they don't take up 3 different layer rows in the layers panel. By holding Command or Control, I can click on all of the layers that I would like to select, represented by that light gray, and then we can press Command or Control G, or click on the new group icon at the bottom of the layers panel to group all of your selected layers. I'll rename this group just the same way as you would rename a layer, and I'll call this to Shape and Brushes. Now we could do this with some other things as well. Holding Command or Control, clicking on the text layers as well as the QR code that are all in the one part of the image. I'll press Command or Control G to group them, call this to Left Graphics. And then I could click on the curves adjustment layer and the image layer, press Command or Control G to group those as well. Or again, click on the group icon at the bottom of your layers panel, and I'll rename this to image. Now, what was once a really tall layer stack that was somewhat confusing is now broken up into just a few simple groups that we can open up and view whenever we want to edit them. Groups operate the same way as a layer in terms of the ways that you can rename them or move them. So if you want to move an entire group, you can just click and drag it below another group, but remember that you're changing the order of all of the layers within the group that you've just moved. So in this case, all of the left graphics here, these 3 layers, are no longer visible because they're behind all of the layers within the group above it, which is the shape and brushes. That is why we no longer see them on the canvas. But if I were to go and move this back above, like so, looking for that blue line to indicate where it will be placed, now all 3 of those layers are moved above the underlying groups. Now, finally, if you want to get really fancy, you can also add color labels as well as lock some elements of individual layers too. For example, if you wanted to go wild and color code everything in your project, you can right click on it and go to color and then choose the color that you would like. Let's say red. Now the area around the eyeball icon for that layer will be color coded, and the same thing applies for all of your other layers. The second option you have is if you want to lock any element of a layer. For example, if you don't want it to move at all, even by accident, you could lock its position, for example. Up near the top of the layers panel beside the lock option, we have a handful of different settings that we can choose from. If you want to lock everything, you can just click on this icon right here, and that's going to lock all of the editable attributes of that selected layer and add a lock icon very similar to what the background layer has. We can unlock that just by clicking on the lock icon. And if you wanted to just lock a single aspect of your layer, such as I don't want this layer to be able to be moved, I can click on the lock position, and that way this layer is locked, but only the position. So therefore I won't be able to move it accidentally within my project. So renaming, grouping, moving, color labels, and adding these custom lock adjustments are the different ways that you can organize and manage your layers in a project. But earlier in this example, you noticed that there was the image layer that is a smart object. I had mentioned that this allows you to scale your images without losing quality, but that probably is a little bit confusing of how that works. So let me explain that a little bit more in depth. In this example here, I have one layer that is a smart object represented by this icon right here, as you hopefully remember. And we have another that is just a regular image layer, not a smart object, which is also known as a rasterized layer. That's just a fancy word. You don't really need to remember that part. Anyways, if I were to scale this rasterized layer down using the move tool, I'll just go and scale this layer down, clicking and dragging all the way down like so. I'll commit to my changes by pressing done, and then I'll scale this layer back up like so. Press enter. You've noticed how this obviously has become a lot lower quality. And that is because with a rasterized layer, when you scale it down, Photoshop basically removes all of the pixels that are no longer needed to display the image at that smaller size. But then when you go and scale it back up again, you have fewer pixels to display the same information at that larger size. Therefore, you end up losing quality as you see here. But with a smart object, your image is added inside of a container. And when you edit your smart object layer, you're editing the container and not the image inside of it. That sounds a little bit confusing, but just think of it as when you're editing a smart object, you're not directly editing the layer within it. Your smart object is a container that holds your image inside of it. Therefore, we can go and scale this container up and down, and it will never lose quality. For example, clicking on that smart object layer, grabbing the move tool by pressing V, I'll just scale this image down just as we did before. Press done to commit to those changes, and then I'll scale this back up like this. Press the check mark or enter to confirm those changes, and the difference between these two photos is pretty obvious. With our rasterized layer, Photoshop removed all of the pixels it didn't need to display it at that smaller size. Therefore, when we made it bigger again, it just looks lower quality because it has less information than it did before. With the smart object layer, however, we're only editing the container, so the image inside of it never gets adjusted. We're just scaling that container up and down, the image inside always remains the same, and therefore that information is never removed. So whenever you're scaling your layers in any way, it's important to remember the value of smart objects. You can convert any layer into a smart object just by right-clicking on it and going to convert to smart object at any time while you're editing your projects. There are some other values of smart objects, but you'll see those in the next example. Now, before we move on to the next example, if you haven't grabbed the free cheat sheet and lesson assets, make sure to go down to the description right now to do that. It's so much easier to learn these concepts when you apply the skills for yourself, and it really makes this lesson feel more like a paint by number rather than this abstract concept. So if you're serious about mastering layers in Photoshop, you should seriously go and grab those resources in the description below. They're totally free by joining my email list, and if you don't like getting emails from me, you can unsubscribe at any time. I just truly want to make sure you get the most possible from this lesson, and those assets will help you do just that. But anyways, the ball is in your court, and we're moving on to the next example. Now at this point, you understand the basic operations and use cases of layers. But now let's go and take that a bit further with some extra layer adjustments that are super valuable in your projects. In particular, layer blending modes, masking and erasing, as well as opacity and fill. So to begin, I just have this photo that I directly opened into Photoshop by going to File, Open, selecting this image, and then we now have it as a new project represented by a background layer. But rather than just discussing the theory behind these next steps, I thought it would be better to create a project. So we'll start by adding our overlay image that you can find for free within the assets that are available in the link below. Before we add that asset in, I want to make sure that you have the same setting as me that allows you to to drag and drop new images into your project as smart objects. We can do that by clicking on Photoshop and then going to Settings and General on a Mac, or if you're on Windows, I believe it's Edit, Preferences, and then General. Regardless, you'll end up in this window here, and you want to enable the Always Create Smart Objects when placing option. This way you can drag and drop images into your project, and then you can scale them up and down without having to worry about losing quality. It'll just save you a little bit of time, and I find it really useful for working with layers. I'll click OK, and now let's go and drag and drop that overlay photo into the project. From the files on my computer, I'll just click and drag that into place, placing it over top of my canvas and letting go. This will now add that image as a new image layer that is a smart object because of the preferences that we just updated. And now we can go and scale this as we would like and discuss blending modes. Using the Move tool and clicking and dragging on the corner anchor points to reposition this, I want to add this sort of flame light glow in the corner of the photo to add a little more color on the outer edge. But the problem here is obviously we have a bunch of black that is blocking the layer underneath. I only want to see this nice orangey flame instead. So when we want to change how one layer interacts with the layers beneath it, and we don't just want to turn that layer off or on, that is where we use layer blending modes. Layer blending modes can get kind of complicated, but to make it really easy, there are only 3 that you need to remember that we'll quickly discuss here. You can change your layer blending modes by clicking on the layer that you want to change the blending mode of, and then go to this option right here, which is normal by default. Hovering through all of the different settings, you can change your layer blending mode as you would like. And notice how that flame layer changes drastically depending on the blending mode that we choose. This is because every blending mode changes how the shadows, midtones, highlights, and colors blend between your top image and the underlying image. In the case of the 3 blending modes that you should absolutely remember inside of Photoshop, the first one is multiply. Now in this case, it doesn't get rid of the black, but it does get rid of any white in your photo. If I click on this, for example, it doesn't necessarily work great for the case of overlays, but if you wanted to blend a color into your image with the help of multiply, we can remove any of the white and turn a solid color or a solid piece of an image into something that blends better into the background underlying photo. The second blending mode, and the one that is useful in this particular situation, is screen. This does the opposite of multiply. Rather than removing white, it's going to remove black, which is why we no longer see all of that black area in our photo. Even though we look at the layer thumbnail, we can see that that black is still visible, but because of our layer blending mode, it's changing how the pixels on this layer are interacting with the layers beneath it. And like I just mentioned, the screen blending mode removes all of the black from your current selected layer, and therefore we have the result like this. The third blending mode to remember is soft light, which will take all of the colors and exposure from your current layer and blend it in nicely with the midtones of all of the layers beneath it. I'll show you a more concrete example of how that can apply in this project in just a moment, but for now I'll change this layer back to screen. Now in this case, I would love for this overlay to blend more with the color of the grass. Well, since we want to adjust the exposure or color of a layer, that means we need an adjustment layer. Going to the adjustments panel, I'll go and click on the hue saturation adjustment, which allows you to easily change the color within a layer. I'll click on that like so to create a new hue saturation adjustment above the last selected layer. And then we can go and just adjust the hue of the photo like this. But notice how this currently changes all the colors in the photo. That's not really what we're looking for. We only want to target this adjustment to the overlay that we recently added in the project. This is where clipping masks come into play, and this is kind of more talking about masking, so we won't get too deep into it. But when you want an adjustment to only apply to a single layer, a clipping mask allows you to do just that. While the hue saturation adjustment is just above the overlay layer, I can click on this icon right here within the properties panel, or I can right click on that adjustment layer and go to create clipping mask. Now, anything that I do on this adjustment layer will only be applied to the layer it is clipped to, which is the overlay layer. We can tell that one layer is clipped to another, represented by this little arrow icon right here, telling us that anything on this layer will only affect the layer it is clipped to. So in this case, let's go and add some green to this. So I will just find some green color. I'll desaturate this a whole bunch. make it a bit darker, and you can play around with these settings until you find something that you like. But that looks good enough for me here. Now, obviously you may not be using overlays in every single photo. So another simple way that you can use a layer blending mode is to brighten your image, for example. By clicking on the background layer, I'll press Command or Control J to duplicate it and now create an image layer. I'll rename this layer to Brighten. With the Brighten layer selected, I'll go to the layer blending mode, and if I change this to Screen, notice how much brighter that photo becomes. Turning that on and off, it becomes twice as bright because we have created a duplicate version of our image layer and we have removed all of the black. Therefore, all of the black and darker midtones stay the same, but all of the brighter midtones and the whites are now doubled because we have another layer that contains only those adjustments. If we were to do the opposite and change this to multiply, for example, it would do the same thing but for darkening, because with multiply we remove the white rather than the black. Therefore, we're doubling the dark tones in the photo because we have that secondary layer, and the whites are not affected in any way. But for this photo, I'm going to go back to Screen, and let's say I want to brighten up some of the sky, for example. In this case, I can't just turn this layer on and off and make this only brighter in the sky. Instead, we need to somehow erase part of this brightening layer. To erase something, you have two different options. You can either use the eraser tool, or you can use something called a layer mask. These are the two different ways that you can change the visibility of a single layer. Let's start by using the eraser tool. If I access the eraser tool by pressing E, or you can find it right here in your toolbar, I'll go and just choose a soft round brush preset for my eraser. My opacity and flow is at 100%, and while that brightening layer is selected, I can just scale up the brush using the bracket keys and then paint over any areas that I want to erase. So anywhere that I paint over will no longer be visible because we're deleting those pixels, like we're erasing pencil from paper. If we look closely at the thumbnail of this layer now, we see that checkerboard that is familiar to us from the transparent layers. This is telling us that there are no pixels anywhere that we have just erased, and instead there is only transparency. If I view this layer by itself, you can clearly see exactly what is going on. We have permanently deleted all of the pixels that we painted over, and only the parts that we have left remain untouched. The problem with this is the fact that when you permanently erase something from a layer, it's gone for good. You can't go and change your mind later or refine any of the erasing adjustments that you have made. This can work fine if you just need a quick adjustment and you never need to look back again, but I would argue that that's a pretty limiting way to work with your layers, because if you ever change your mind down the road, you can't do it. Instead, with layer masks, we can get the exact same results and hide pixels from our layer, but we aren't permanently deleting them. To show you what I mean, I'll press Command or Control Z to undo that. Now we have all of our pixels back in view on that brightening layer. To add a layer mask this time, rather than erasing, we can click on the layer that we want to add a mask to, and then click on the layer mask icon. We'll create this white box, which is a layer mask, and you'll notice that some other layers also have these created by default. In the world of layer masks, anything that is white is fully visible, and anything that is black is fully invisible. Therefore, because this layer mask is white, that means that everything on this layer is visible on our canvas. If we were to click on this layer mask and press Command or Control I to turn white into black, now everything on this layer is invisible on our canvas because our layer mask is fully black and therefore fully invisible. Now, layer masks are a topic on their own, so don't feel discouraged if this feels kind of confusing. I'll leave some resources in the description below for you to watch after this lesson, but for now, just pay attention to what's happening next and how it's so much better than the eraser tool. Pressing Command or Control I to turn this layer mask back to fully visible, I want to just remove the same area as I did before with the eraser. On a layer mask, we don't use an eraser and instead can just use our brush and paint black, which again is fully invisible, to hide pixels on our selected layer. So activating the brush tool by pressing B, just like we did before with the eraser, I'll select the soft round brush and make sure the opacity and flow are at 100%, and then I'll set my foreground color to black, so that means I'll be painting black with my brush. Clicking on that layer mask of the brighten layer, I'll scale up the brush like so and paint over the photo just as I did previously with the eraser. Notice how we get the exact same result, and if I just look at this one layer, we have the exact same result as we had with the eraser. The only difference, however, is if we look at the contents of this layer, all of our pixels are still there. The entire image layer is still in view. But because of our layer mask, we have painted black to hide any pixels that we do not want in view, which is this entire lower area. However, the advantage to this is that if I set my foreground color to white, painting on that same layer mask, unlike the eraser where our adjustments are permanent, now by painting white, which is visibility on that layer mask, I can add back pixels to the same exact layer as before, just by switching back and forth between white and black. With the help of layer masks, you have way more control and flexibility of how an individual layer is visible within a project. But in this case, I just want it to affect the sky, so we can just brighten the sky in our image. So I'll set my foreground color back to black, and I'll just hide any of the pixels that I do not want to brighten, like this, turning back on the visibility of all my other layers. And if you're wondering what shortcut I'm using here, just hold Alt or Option and click on the eyeball icon of a single layer to isolate it within your project. You can now see that this adjustment is only affecting the sky in the photo, but maybe this feels a little bit too intense. And when a layer is too visible within your canvas, that is where opacity comes into play. Opacity allows you to change how transparent a single layer is, and this is particularly useful for adjustments, like we are here with a brightening adjustment. So while this layer is still selected, up at the top of the layers panel here, we have the opacity slider. If I click and drag this down, it's going to reduce the visibility of the pixels on that selected layer. So when my opacity is at 50%, for example, that means the pixels on this layer are 50% visible, or at 50% intensity, depending on how you like to think about it. Now turning that on and off, we have a much more subtle brightening adjustment, again because of our screen blending mode, and then blend it in a little bit more nicely with the help of the opacity. Now let's say I want to give this image a more whimsical feel and add sort of a blur around the outer edge, and then maybe a bit more warm colors. Well, when we start working with filters, which are things like blurs or sharpening adjustments, for example, that is another use case for smart objects because they allow you to use smart filters, and you'll see why that's helpful in just a second here. So to begin, I'll click on my background layer and press Command or Control J to duplicate it. Now you may be wondering why I haven't just been editing the background layer by just unlocking it and using that to make all of these adjustments. But remember that when we're adding new elements to a project, we want everything to be on its own layer. So since we never want to permanently edit the base image, which is the contents of the background layer, we're just constantly creating new layers above it to edit how it looks on our canvas. For example, we have our brightening adjustment and then our overlay, and then we're going to go and add a smart filter on this newly duplicated layer. So ultimately, when you're editing photos, you can pretty much just leave your background layer as is and just duplicate versions as you need to add new adjustments. Now, getting back on track here, like I said, we want to create a blur. So I'm going to rename this layer to blur and then convert this layer into a smart object by right-clicking on it and going to convert to smart object. Once again, we have that icon right here, but we're not scaling this photo. Instead, we want to add a filter by going up to Filter, and for this particular case, I'll go to Blur and Gaussian Blur. This will apply that filter onto our selected layer in the Layers panel. In this case, I'll just add some kind of light blur like this, and then click OK. Now, if we look at our Layers panel, we have something that's a bit unique. We have something that's called a Smart Filter, and beneath it, we have the filter adjustment that we just applied. This will only appear beneath Smart Object layers, and it allows you to go back and change any of your filter adjustments at any point in your project. If you did not have a smart object layer, it would be directly applied onto that layer and you would not be able to update the filter later on. This is kind of like the comparison between erasing pixels versus using a layer mask. When you apply your filter directly, it's permanent, just like erasing, but when you use a smart filter, it's like a layer mask and you can change it at any time. All you need to do is just double click on the words of the filter that you want to edit to re-access those settings. But in this case, I want to make this blur only visible in the outer edges of the photo. So within every smart filter, there is this white box, which represents a layer mask, just as all the other white boxes we've seen so far have represented. Like I mentioned before, white is fully visible, meaning that this Gaussian blur is fully visible on this particular layer. But if I wanted this to be invisible, I can click on the smart filter mask and press Command or Control I to invert it. Now white has become black, or visibility has become transparency, and this Gaussian blur adjustment is not visible. However, just like we did with a layer mask, we can paint back visibility with the brush tool for this single adjustment. Activating the brush tool by pressing B, I'll choose the soft round brush, same settings as before, but this time I'll set my foreground color to white, which is visibility in the world of layer masks. Therefore, with this smart filter mask that is fully black, aka invisible, I can go and paint white around any areas that I want that blur to show up inside of the photo. Now, if I wanted that blur to be a little bit less intense, I could just go to my brush opacity, bring this down a little bit. Let's go to like 30%. And now I'll paint a less intense blur in more inner areas of the photo like so. Looking at our layer mask, you can see the white is anywhere that things are visible, and black represents the areas that our Gaussian blur filter is not editing. Therefore, we can apply that blur just to the outer edge of the photo, and this same concept applies to any other filter that you use while you pair it with a smart object. Because again, smart object layers not only let you scale your layer without losing quality, it allows you to edit your filter adjustments using smart filters, allowing you to make these type of selective adjustments non-destructively within your project. Just as we had done before with the opacity of our brightening adjustment, if something on this layer seemed too intense, we could always click on that layer and go to the layer opacity and just reduce the visibility of it to change the intensity of any of our filter adjustments as well. But for this case, I'll just leave it to 100%. Now, the final thing, just to show a use case for the soft light blending mode, is using a colored brush to add a little bit of life into your images. In this case, I'll go to the top of the layer stack and I'll add a new transparent layer. The reason I clicked on that topmost layer is because every time you create a new layer, it will be placed above your last selected layer. I just selected the hue saturation adjustment, therefore my transparent layer was placed above that. I'll rename this to warm glow, and then let's go and sample a yellow color. Going to the foreground color swatch, I'll choose an orangey yellow color like this, for example, and click OK. While my brush tool is still active, I'll set the opacity to 100%, and I'm using a soft round brush just like before. While this transparent layer is selected, that warm glow layer, I'll just go and paint around the sky and the edges here like this. Now, obviously, we've just painted a hard color onto our photo, and this looks like a toddler has scribbled on our image or something. So with the help of blending modes, we can blend that color in. And with soft light, we can make it blend into the midtones really nicely. So changing the layer blending mode of that new layer down here to soft light, we can blend that color into the photo. Now this obviously looks a little bit off, it's a little too intense, so let's reduce the opacity of this layer. I'll bring it all the way down to 0% so it's no longer visible, and then I'll slowly increase the intensity of that until I like how it looks in the photo. So this looks a little bit more approachable and nice. It blends in a bit better than before. So what started as this ugly school bus color on top of our image has now blended in to this warm sort of feel on the final photo, enhancing some of the light. So looking at our before and after, I'll hold Alt or Option and click on the eyeball icon of this background layer. You can see the huge difference that we've added to this image using a variety of different layers and some more advanced layer techniques with blending modes, opacity, as well as smart filters and layer masks. All of this stuff will certainly take some practice to get used to, but now let's go and take all of your layer skills that you've developed so far and challenge them a little bit more with a poster design here in Photoshop. In this final project, we'll create this design together using all of the layer techniques that you've learned so far, plus a few new ones that I think you'll find kind of interesting. So to begin, you want to create a new blank document by going to File, New, and then you want to set your width and height to the values that I have down here, which is 2550 by 3300 pixels at 300 pixels per inch. With that good to go, you'll end up with a canvas like this, and we can go ahead and drag and drop our first image into place. I've already gone ahead and done that, and it is placed as a smart object because of the preference settings that you learned about in the last example. But our first step in this process is to remove the background from this subject. I have lots of videos explaining selections, and I'm not going to get too deep into it here. If you're totally new to selections, make sure to check the resources below, where I have a lesson explaining explaining everything you need to know about selections for beginners. But in this case, I'm just going to use the quick selection tool by pressing W, and then in the options bar, I'll choose the cloud detailed results. And while our subject layer is selected, I'll click on select subject, and now we'll have an automatic selection. It will likely miss a few areas, so we can go to our selection tool and choose the add to selection mode, and then just add any additional areas that we want to include in our selection. I've already gone ahead and done this, so I'm going to skip ahead to when my selection is complete. But when you're finished with your selection, just make sure your subject layer is selected and then click on the layer mask icon to remove the background. What you should be left with now is an image layer with a layer mask that has removed the background. If we look at the subject, however, they're a little bit yellow, so I want to convert this into a black and white image. And you guessed it, we're going to use an adjustment layer. Within the adjustments panel, I'll go to the black and white adjustment, make sure it's directly above that subject layer. And since I want it to only edit the subject layer, I'll click on the clipping mask icon to isolate this adjustment to the underlying layer. We can change some of the exposure values playing around with these sliders as you would like, but I'll meet you when this is complete. Now, since we'll be having a lot of layers in this project, I'll keep things organized by holding Command or Control, clicking on these two layers and pressing Command or Control G to group them. I'll call this to subject. Now let's change that background color using the help of a fill layer, which if you remember from before is a layer that either contains a solid color, a gradient, or a pattern. To create this, I'll go down to the adjustments icon and click and hold and go to solid color. I'll change this color swatch to DC, 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 which is this sort of gray, and I'll click OK. Now I want this to be behind my subject, so I'll click and drag it below the subject group. So therefore my subject appears in front of the background layer. Next, let's go add some text into this. We're creating a magazine after all, so we're going to call this the Musician Weekly. I'll activate my type tool by pressing T, and I'll just click on my canvas like so. I'll type musician in all caps, and I'll press the check mark to confirm those changes. I'll then change the color of this type layer to white, and I'll click OK. For the font that I'll use, I'll change this to a font called Fat Frank. It's kind of a funny name, but it is a nice looking font for our uses here. If you don't see that font, you can find it within the More Fonts option. I'll just go ahead and grab the Move tool now and scale this up like so and place it across the back of the photo. I now want those letters to be a bit closer together, and we're kind of getting outside of the scope of layers, but a fun fact, when you need to edit your text, we can go to our Characters panel, which can be found by going to Window and down here to Character. And inside of this, we can control things like our letter spacing and things like that. So I'll bring this in like so, and then continue to use the Move tool to reposition this so it fills up the background. And then I want to stretch this out using the Move tool once again. So I'll hold the Shift key and just stretch this down like so. Now we have this nice big text in the background of the photo. Press the check mark to confirm those changes, and let's add our second piece of text, which is just weekly. Accessing the type tool by pressing T, I'll click once, type weekly in all caps, once again, using the same font and color as before. Press the check mark to confirm those changes, grab the Move tool by pressing V, and I'll just scale this and put it into position like so. Now when I'm doing this, you might notice that there's these pink lines that are helping me to align my layers as I position them within the project. This is called snapping or smart guides, and you can enable this within your settings super easily. I'd recommend you definitely do that. So just go up to View and then down here to Snap and make sure that this is enabled. We then want to make sure our Snap to settings are enabled like so, and with that good to go, you'll see those little lines everywhere you go and reposition something, and it will just help align your different type elements. Now I want to add a little bit of a drop shadow behind the text, and this brings us into a useful panel called Layer Styles that you can use anytime you need to add shadows or outlines or glows or anything like that to a specific layer. This is particularly useful on text and shapes, but it can be used on any layer. To access this, we can just click on the layer that we want to add the effect to, and then double click in the empty area of it to access Layer Styles. There's a ton of different options to choose from. I'll leave it to you to go experiment and play around with the different options that are in here, but for now, I'm just going to go straight to the drop shadow and enable that. We got a crazy result here, so I'm going to just bring back the distance and refine some of these settings so I have a much more subtle shadow behind the text. I'll then reduce the opacity of that shadow, which works the exact same way as layer opacity. It's just making that shadow a little bit less visible. With that good to go, I'll click OK, and you'll notice beneath that layer, we now have an effect known as a drop shadow. Anytime you see these options here, or you see this little effects setting, that means that something from your layer styles has been applied to that specific layer. This can be done on any layer type, excluding background layers, so just keep that in mind if you ever see these options. I want to add that same drop shadow effect onto the weekly text, so rather than redoing the entire process, we can duplicate our effect by clicking on the effects icon, holding Alt or Option, and then dragging onto the other layer that we want to duplicate that effect to. So again, holding Alt or Option, clicking and dragging on effects, and letting go over the layer that we want to duplicate that effect onto. Therefore, we now have 2 drop shadows on our text. We of course want our musician text to be behind our subject, so I'll click and drag the musician text below the subject group to place it behind that layer within our canvas. Now let's add a few different shape layers, including a shape pattern and some gradients. First, I'll access the rectangle tool, which you can find within your shape tools here. And then up in the options bar, I'll set the fill down here to pattern. So these settings here are just like fill layers. We have a pattern fill, a gradient fill, and a solid color fill. And since we're choosing the pattern fill, I'm going to go ahead and choose a stripe pattern that I've created already. And if you want to download that for yourself, it's available within the assets and cheat sheet link in the description below. With that selected, I'll just click and drag out to create a box for these stripes to appear in. This creates a new rectangle layer that was above my last selected layer, which was the musician layer. Therefore, it appears behind the subject because it is underneath the subject group. Going back up to my fill settings, I want to make these lines vertical, so I'll change the angle to be vertical and then change the scale down until we have something a little bit more narrow like this. This looks good here at 15% for the scale. Now we want this rectangle layer to appear as a background element behind everything else. So it's currently blocking the musician layer, so I'll click and drag it underneath the musician text like so. Now, since it's just a little bit too intense with the black, I want it to be just kind of a gray color instead. We can just reduce the opacity of that rectangle layer. So while that's selected, we'll go to the opacity and bring that down like so to make this blend in a little bit better in the background. I'll rename this to stripes, and to make it look a little bit more interesting, I want to add a dark shadow in the background of the photo as well. So I'll create a new transparent layer because this allows us to just paint whatever the heck we want on that layer. I'll grab the brush tool by pressing B, and then I'll set my foreground color to black. While that new layer is selected, I'll call this to black shadow. My opacity and flow is at 100% with a soft round brush. I can just scale up this brush to a nice large size and just click and paint in the area I want to darken up like so. Now, obviously we have that same undesirable result as we had in the last example with that glowy warm effect. So we can use our blending modes to fix that problem, changing the black shadow layer blending mode from normal down here to soft light, for example. Or in this case, we can try overlay, which is similar to soft light, but a lot more contrast. If you want to know more about all of the little details of every single blending mode, I'll leave a resource below this video sharing every single blending mode and what they do if you want to read that. But anyway, setting that to overlay, it just adds this nice dark color in the corner and adds a little life to that shape. To keep things organized, once again, I'll hold Command or Control and click on the black shadow and the stripes layer, and I'll press Command or Control G to group them. I'll rename this to stripe pattern. Now to continue on with the shapes that we'll add, I want to add 2 gradient circles, one behind the subject's shoulder and the other one around her knee. So once again, accessing our shape tools because we want to create a new shape layer, I'll select the ellipse tool because I want to create a circle. Now I'll go up to the fill settings and I'll choose the gradient option, and I want to choose a black to white gradient like this. If you don't have this set by default, you can just go into the basics folder and choose your black to white gradient in here. Anyways, I'll just click and drag out to create the circle. And if I hold the shift key, it will create a perfect circle, and I'll place it somewhere like this. Using the move tool by pressing V, I can just go and position this into place, maybe in this location like so. And then rather than repeating this process, I can just press Command or Control J on that first shape layer to create an exact copy of it. And then with the move tool, I can move it over this way and then scale it down, reposition it as I need, and do something like this. In an effort to keep everything organized, once again, I'll rename these to small circle and large circle. Finally, let's go and add a little blurb about the inside of this weekly magazine. So I'll just go back to the shapes, select the rectangle tool, and then click and drag out like so in an area to create a text box. Let's go somewhere around here. I want this to be a solid color, so I'll go to the fill option, choose solid color and then black. And of course, I don't want this to be covered by the guitar. So I'll drag this layer above the subject like so. Maybe I'll reposition it down just a little bit so we can see the top of the guitar coming out like that. And I'll go back to the small circle layer and reposition this with the move tool as well. So that's now in view. Next, since I want to add some text within this box, I'll click on that rectangle layer, which I'll rename to black text box, and then access the type tool by pressing T. Using the same Fat Frank font as before, I'll set the text color to white this time, click OK, and then go and type 10 chords and press the check mark. This will be our title. I'll grab the move tool, reposition this into place and scale it up using the move tool to just fit within our text box here. Again, because I have snapping enabled, those little pink lines make it really easy to center everything within this shape. I'll press it done. And now I want to add a little blurb underneath our 10 chords title. So I'll just access the type tool once again, click on the canvas, and then I'm just going to paste in what I wanted to write here, these chords will change the way you play music forever. I'm going to change the font of this to a different font. So I'll press Command or Control A to select everything on this text layer. And then I'll change the font to Freight Macro Pro Medium and then press the check mark to confirm those changes. Using the move tool, I can position this into place, but something that will be useful if you ever want to create a text box is to change your text into paragraph text. That's a bit outside of the scope of this lesson of the reasoning behind it, but essentially, if you just need to create text in a small area, just try to convert your text into paragraph text as I'm about to do right now. Right-clicking on that text layer, I'll go down here to convert to paragraph text. And now when I click on that text layer while my type tool is active, I can adjust this box like so. And so I can position this text just within the area that I want. It makes it a lot easier to place things rather than having to fight this endless long line of text. Pressing the check mark to confirm those changes, I'll hold Command or Control and click on both of these text layers that are within this text box, grab the move tool by pressing V, and then just try to center this up a little bit better. You can use your arrow keys to bump things if you would like, just pressing up, down, left, or right to nudge your selected layer in any direction by 1 pixel. That looks good enough there, but I will probably want to make this text a little bit smaller. So clicking on the text layer I want to edit, I'll go to the type size, and I'll change this to maybe 12, for example. Since our type is now that much smaller, I'll click on the text box, grab the move tool, and then hold the shift key and squish this text box in like so. Press the check mark to confirm those changes. And now to finish things off, I'll just quickly group all of these, clicking on the black text box, holding Command or Control, clicking on the 10 chords text as well as the subtext, and then pressing Command or Control G to group everything at once here. I'll rename this to subtext and press enter. Now what we're left with is a complete poster using a whole bunch of different layers, some layer styles, different opacity adjustments, layer blending modes, and a bunch of layer organization techniques to make all of this happen. Now I understand that this could be a little bit intense depending on where you're at in Photoshop and how much practice you've had in the past, but if you work through everything that we talked about up until this point, this just gives you a more advanced and quick view of how layers operate all together to create pretty much any edit or photo design that you imagine. Okay, so that was a lot that we just covered, but thanks for still being here. As one of the few who are still sticking around, I just want to ask you a quick favor. Let me know down in the comments below the most useful thing that you got from this lesson. It really helps me to better understand where you're at in your Photoshop journey and what other deep dive lessons I could create for you in the future. But if you learned nothing, that's okay too. You can also leave a comment and hit that dislike button while you're at it. I'm sorry that you stuck around this long in a video that you hated. But in all seriousness, if you did enjoy this lesson and want a useful resource guide to help cement your knowledge of layers, make sure to grab your free copy of the lesson cheat sheet in the description below. Anyways, thank you so much for joining me here, and I'll see you in the next one.